Hey there, welcome to Authentically Raw. I'm your host, Jamie Berris. Hello, Merle Saferstein. How are you? Welcome to the Authentically Raw podcast.
Thank you, Jamie. I'm delighted to be here today.
Absolutely. I'm really excited for this conversation. I'm going to introduce you as the author of Living and Leaving My Legacy. There's so much more, so please unpack and tell us who you are, what you do.
Okay. I began my career as an educator. I taught elementary school and did that for 4.5 years, and then eventually became a preschool teacher. I went back to that when my son was 3 and he was going to preschool, so I figured that would be a good thing to do. I directed a preschool for a while. I directed a very large day camp with 350 children, and when I look back, I was 30. How old was I? I was 34 when I started, and I can hardly believe the responsibility of what that was, but it was great fun. And then my career kind of morphed, and I did a few other things in between. At one point, I had the great opportunity to bring the exhibition Anne Frank in the World, 1929 to 1945, to Miami. It was just by coincidence that all this happened, and that took me to volunteering at a Holocaust center in South Florida. And within a few months, I started out, they actually asked me to help them do student programming. And once I started doing that, the secretary quit, and they asked me if I would be secretary. I said I will, but only for 3 months. If I'm not in education, I really need to move on. And they had hired someone with her PhD to head the department, and she turned out to be a disaster. And my boss kept giving me all the administrative jobs. And finally, they just fired her. And the president of the center at the time was the president of one of the universities. He took me out to breakfast. He grilled me for 3 hours and came back and said, "She can do this." So I became the director of educational outreach for 26 years at the Holocaust Center.
Wow.
And then when I retired from that, so I was 67. I knew I wanted to write. I had been wanting to write one book about the Hollywood Beach Hotel, where the Hollywood Beach is a place that I go to often. And so I used that as my reason to leave, because it was time to write. But I also knew I wanted to speak. I knew I wanted to teach, and I knew I wanted to volunteer. So I spent the very last year while I was working at the center figuring out just what my life would look like once I retired. So at 67, I had just turned 67. I walked out the door of the Holocaust Center. I began writing a book. And then, and during that year, I had figured out that I could teach legacy. I didn't know what it looked like really, and I wasn't sure there was a market for it. But I started doing research, and I started looking at the possibility of having people maybe be interested in looking at their own lives and their legacy. So since then, so that was 2011 when I retired. I started the first class at the end of 2012. I've taught 68 6 to 8 week classes since then, and have gotten very involved in working with hospice organizations. I do a weekend retreat with children who have lost family members, and also I do a full day with their parents, helping them deal with their children's loss and their loss, and showing them what kinds of things we did with their children over the weekend so that they can be prepared to know that their children can really talk about this loss. And I've trained legacy staff, hospice staffs on legacy work. So I've been doing all kinds of things and really enjoying my retirement.
Wow. So the class that you teach is called what?
It's called Living and Leaving Your Legacy. And when I first started, I divided it into two halves. So the first was how you live your life. And the second half is what you're going to leave behind, something material. And what ended up happening when I started teaching was I realized that it's really much more about the first half, because really how we live our life becomes our legacy. And so then after 1 or 2 classes, I started shifting. and do much more on having people reflect on their life and understand that they set the example. So it's not what you say, it's really what you do. And then the last 2 sessions are basically just helping them do either an ethical will or an oral history or scrapbook or something, some kind of legacy project that they may want to do. So that's what I do. I also work with people at the end of their lives doing sacred legacy work.
Okay. Yeah, I guess that would be my question. So do you work more with people at the end of their life, in the middle, like where?
So what I've really come to learn is that it's never too soon to think about this. And my very favorite classes are the ones with younger people. So I would say starting with age, well, I did a workshop for my daughter's friends in Atlanta. There were about 40 women who were around 40. And it was really exciting to be able to help them plant the seeds. I have one woman in my class who started early on, so she's been in my class for years now, and she was 38 at the time. And there was a man who was 92 in the same class, and I'll never forget the day he looked at her and he said, "What in the hell are you doing here?" And she said, "I'm here because I want to live the best life I can." And so it's really all ages. I much prefer doing this work with people who are well and healthy. And while sometimes it's hard for them because they think that their families, if they do something, their families are going to think they're dying, I have to work really hard to help them understand the importance of, it's not about that at all. It's really when we look at, we look at the end of our life, we're really looking at what are we leaving? What are the life lessons? What are the things? And so that's part of living.
Do you feel like, as you speak, I think so much about how it shapes your life currently. Do you feel like a lot of people come and I guess, is there a shift ever? Like when people come and then what it evolves into is, what does that look like? Because I can feel like if I am working on leaving my legacy, you put so much thought into who you are for other people, these life lessons and things like that. And it's pretty easy to go through life blowing that stuff off, right?
Right. So I'll just give you an example.
Mm-hmm.
A long time ago, I was interviewed and someone asked me, how do you want to be remembered? And I had a long list of, I knew exactly how I wanted to be remembered. And then years later, one of the women from my writing class, so I do a class with women who have been impacted by cancer. And one of the women was dying. And I went to the hospice place where she was at. And there were 5 of us from the class who all went together to see her. I had gone separately, but I also encouraged them to come with me. And Marie was someone who was very open. She was very open about talking about death. And I'm someone who likes to ask questions. So I asked her a lot of questions and she answered all our questions. And we had an amazing conversation. And at one point I turned to her and I said, Maria, how do you want us to remember you? And she thought for a minute and she looked at me and she said to me, Merle, it doesn't matter how I want you to remember me. You're going to remember me the way you want to remember me. At which point I now say to people, how do you want to be remembered? And are you living your life in that way? Mm-hmm. So we can want to be remembered. We can want all of that, but unless we're actually doing it, it's not going to happen. So I'm really cautious about that and help people to understand that, for example, one of the very first things I do in a class is I have them list 20 things that bring them joy. Mm-hmm. And then ask questions like, when was the last time you did this? Is this something your mother or father would have done? Does this cost money? Is this something you think you're going to be doing 5 years from now? And then we talk about it. And my reason for doing that is really the very first question. When was the last time you did it? Because so often people have things that bring them joy, but they're not living their life that way. They're not doing those things. And so to me, that's the most important thing. It's waking up and realizing that you need to be living your life in the way that's going to make you happiest, in the way that's going to bring you satisfaction. And so I do think that starting off the class that way, and then looking at people who have impacted their lives, and then looking at how they've impacted lives, those kinds of things help people to really live differently, live more intentionally, I think.
It really is basically a self-examination of your life.
Absolutely.
Even asking yourself that question, to me, would bring out, who am I?
Right.
Because everybody's going to want to be remembered in a different way based on their own personality. And it really does pose the question, well, am I being that person?
Right. Right. So it's interesting, when I left, before I left the Holocaust Center, I spent a year trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And I posed several questions, like 25 questions. And one of the questions was, who am I? And another question is, who will I be when I'm no longer the director of educational outreach? So one week I answered the question, who am I? And spent a long time answering it. And the next week, when I went to answer the second question, I said to myself, I should look back and see what I wrote, just out of curiosity. And when I did, I realized that I had never once mentioned my title of being the director of educational outreach. And I said, okay, that's great. I don't have to worry about that. I can move along. So sometimes it's just knowing who we are and not attaching ourselves to our titles and positions, but to who we are in our soul.
That was the exact question I was going to ask you. Did you give yourself any titles when you said, who am I?
Yeah, no, I didn't.
I'm curious, can I ask what a couple of those things were then, or maybe even now?
Well, for me, who I am is someone who needs to do what speaks to my soul.
Yeah.
And I know that what makes me happiest is when I'm doing for others, when I'm making a difference in someone else's life. And I'm someone who, above all else, I think connection is what really matters to me. So those are some of the who I am. And I think doing this kind of work really does help me to look at my life. And of course, because I journal, that's a whole other story. But I really do know that, like Socrates said, an unexamined life is a life not worth living. And I'll never forget one of the women in my class. That was the first thing I said at the beginning of one of the classes. And this woman said, well, then I guess I shouldn't be here. And I thought to myself, why did you sign up for this class?
That's exactly what we're going to do.
And at the end, she brought me a huge bouquet of flowers and said, thank you. I guess I was off track.
It becomes the question of what lights me up.
Absolutely.
It's because I think it's easy sometimes, who am I? Everybody falls into that role of their roles, of their titles, of what they're, and when we even just start to evolve all of those questions, how much more it can pull out of us too. What lights me up? And then, what causes joy? And what do I feel when I'm doing this? And that is a great way to examine your life. So tell me though, because I do want to go into the journaling, and I do know you've kept journals for 48 years. Is it more than that now?
I started yes, it's 49. I started in 74. Okay. So we're moving on to almost 50 years. Yeah.
Wow. And you were incredibly vulnerable because you plucked out, was it 17 years and went through your journals and plucked things out?
So I took 14 years. What happened was that I knew that at some point, I always thought I'd leave my journals to my children. And I have a collection now of over 380 journals. I mean, that's a lot of journals.
It's a lot of journals.
A lot of journals. And I remember once, a long time ago, I was walking with my friend, and I was telling her I was going to leave them to the kids. And she said to me, Merle, that's a big responsibility, or it's a big burden. I'm like, really? I mean, it didn't seem that way at the time. But then the more I thought about it, the more I realized that, in fact, my journals I wrote for myself. And in those journals are things that I commit to paper that I really wouldn't want anyone to see. Mm-hmm. And also that people shared their confidences with me. And at times I might have actually written about them just to process what they were telling me. And I sure would not ever want to expose that. So in the year 2000, I started thinking about, okay, what am I going to do? And I knew that as an educator, I kept thinking to myself, you have got to have written something worth sharing. But I had no idea, because I would write my journals and just put them away and never look back. So I decided to start going through them. And when I did, I realized that I really did want to share. And so I started with 70 topics. And well, I started with 40, it grew to 70. And I went through, it took me 14 years to go through my journals, take out topics, excerpts according to different topics. And then when I finished after 14 years, I mean, it was crazy, really crazy. Wherever I went, I had a journal, I had my Post-it notes, I was always working on it. When I finished it, I then had 70 topics, with each one being anywhere from 75 typewritten single-space pages to 450 pages. And then it was a matter of, okay, so which topics are you really willing to share, or that people might even be interested in? And so I was deleting. I mean, after all that work, I would just delete, just completely delete a topic and think, okay, if I ever wanted it still in my journals, I could go back and find that information.
Right.
And then I narrowed it down to 22 topics and decided I would write 2 books with 11 topics in each. And then it was a matter of 5 years of whittling down those topics to a sizable chapter. So it was a good 20 years in the making. So I published one of the volumes in 2022, and then the second one I just published in June of this 23. And it was just absolutely insane, but unbelievably fabulous and important experience to do.
So many things. Number one, I think, how on earth did you even wrap your brain around that? That is incredible. And what was it like going back and reading some of that stuff?
So I'll start by saying, when I told my husband I was going to do this, he said to me, does this mean when I come home one day, you're going to be upset with me all over again? I said, I don't know, we'll see. And then one day he walked in the door and fire was coming out of my eyes. He said, okay, I know, I have the answer. It was such a journey. First of all, it was very emotional. I mean, there were times that I actually, as I'm telling you, even the tears are coming into my eyes, thinking about some of the really difficult moments and going through them, because I didn't just write casually. I mean, I was committing to paper everything I was thinking and feeling. And so to go back to a difficult time in our life, or the loss of someone that I loved, or a time when I was really in search of myself, trying to figure out who I was, what I am, going through an existential crisis, all of that stuff, to go back and read it was not easy. But it also was so enlightening. And I was able to see, for example, where I planted a seed, you know, where I was able to put down on paper a thought and then watch it grow over the years. And so for me, this was really huge, to be able to have the opportunity to do that.
Mm-hmm. Which leads me to my question. And we did talk about this a tiny bit before I hit record, and I, myself included, but I can think of so many listeners, even when you're journaling, even though it's to yourself, there is that fear of, what if someone else reads it? Like, that I have to make it a little bit buffered, or I can't really say that. That's horrible, you know, but you're thinking it, you're feeling it. It's yours. You want to get it down on paper. Did you ever feel, I guess this would be a twofold question. Did you ever feel like you couldn't be 100% honest and real and authentic and vulnerable in yours? And were you ever writing your journals with the intentions that you would be leaving it to your kids? And did that kind of alter it?
I'll answer the second question first. No, I never wrote for my children. So that was never, ever an issue. I, a long time ago, realized that the real value and gift of journaling is to not censor yourself, to be able to say it all. And so I literally made a conscious effort and a commitment to myself. It was crazy, but I said to myself, if you don't write down everything that you're thinking and feeling because you're afraid to commit it to paper, then you're going to have to stop journaling. So if you hesitate and you don't put it down, then you're just going to put your pen down and walk away and not journal. And I am a firm believer that it's so important to be able to say what's so and put it down on paper. And so what I suggest to people, for example, my journaling circles, is if there's something that is really emotional that you are afraid someone's going to read, but you need to say it, don't write it in a journal. Write it on a piece of paper, get it out, and then do a ceremony. Tear it up, light a fire, bury it, do something, but get it out. It's almost as though when we clear our minds of that, we are so much freer. Just like if we clean our home of clutter, we feel freer living in that home. And so to me, I think it's really important. I know there are lots of people who hesitate to journal because when they were younger, someone read their diary and they don't, or they just feel they're in an atmosphere where they can't trust people. The truth is, I could leave my journal out and my husband would never open it or look at it, even if it were open. My daughter, as she grew older, maybe I'm going to say maybe 10 years ago, so she's now 52. As she told me, she confessed to me that she had read my journal once. And I said, why? And she told me that something had happened. She had told someone something. That person's mother called me and told me, even though I really didn't want to hear. It was something a mother did not need to know about her child. And when my daughter came to me and said, I want to do this, whatever, I said, no, you can't. And she said, why not? I said, because last time you did it, this is what happened. And she wanted to know who told me. She said, I wanted to know who I couldn't trust anymore. And I said, you know what, that's fair. So that's it. I mean, otherwise, I just know that I need to have the safety. And I do, and I think it's really important to establish that. I remember one time my in-laws were in town. My mother-in-law was very nosy. And I always got up early and wrote. And so I was up early. I wrote on the couch where I always sit when I write, and went out to jog. And I just turned the corner around the block, and I said, oh no, you better go back and you better put that journal away, because I could just imagine coming home and having my mother-in-law just be in it. So, but I know it's difficult. And so I really do think that we need to protect ourselves, but I also think it's so important to be able to say what's so.
I do too. And I also think sometimes there's that fear of really having to face your own truths about things, because we want to, stuff things down, bury it, pretend it's not there, or kind of gloss things over in our life as a protective mechanism. I mean, who doesn't want to, and when you write out things that are really raw and you're reading it and you're getting it out, it can really open up that emotional can of worms that, oh, now it's there and now I have to deal with it, which is a good thing, but it's scary.
It's very scary, and it's very important. It's really important. The one time that I think we have to be careful about what we write is for when we're writing after a trauma. And I always thought that it was really important to be able to write out whatever it was if one has experienced some kind of trauma. And then as the years have gone by and I've gone to more workshops and learned more, I realized that it's not necessarily true. You can re-traumatize yourself. And so what I say is write just 5 minutes of whatever it is, and just slowly get to the point where you can really write about it. But I think that even then it's important to be able to, it's like a self-witness, when you write it down and it's there, you see it on paper in a different way than when it's in your mind.
It's very self-validating.
For better or worse.
Absolutely. So one other thing we hit on a little bit before I hit record is you asked a little bit about me. And I told you how I got started on the podcast and told you about the book that I'm writing, The People Pleaser's Guide to Pissing People Off, and how, I've struggled with it for years because it was more of just that self-development book. And I had so many different versions of it, almost due to my editor. I'm up to here because that exact same thing, like with the journaling, I started looking at it and I was so incredibly fearful of the rejection or shame and the criticism. And I had so many different voices. At times in my life, I was really angry, and then I felt like I was preachy, and I couldn't give it to her, and was begging and pleading to God. And he answered me in just the title. So I have slowed down and started to rewrite it. And when I mentioned that to you, you did tell me about your friend that is the psychiatrist, because she had some wise words. Because this is, whether you're writing a book or just journaling, or, beginning to really do it to leave a legacy, if it is something for other people, I'm going to use social media for an example. We have become, I think, a society that filters so much of who we truly are. And a lot of it it's these different fears that we have. And of course, and I know my fears now, my fears are those big three: the fear of shame, criticism, and rejection. And that's what I'm curious, because I know I'm not alone and you're not either. And how does one get over that? Because you wouldn't think, oh, I have writer's block, I'm just writing my own journal.
One of the things that I've learned is that when we speak our shame, it dissipates.
Yeah.
And how I learned that, I mean, really, really learned it and knew it, was in teaching my classes. And at one point, we were talking about pivotal moments in our lives. And I decided to share a time in my life where financially we went down the tubes, and it was really difficult, and we ended up going bankrupt. And it was really both that my husband and I had looked the other way and didn't really understand what we were doing. And anyway, it doesn't matter why, but the fact was that I decided that I would share it. And when I did, all of a sudden, everyone in the class opened up. It took things to a different level because I was willing to share my stuff. People shared in a way that they hadn't before. And one of the things that fascinated me was I was doing one class with a group of women who had been together for 15 years. It was 16 women. Mm-hmm. They met every other week, and they asked me to do an 8-week class with them. And so I did. And I did this one exercise, and I asked them to share after I shared my story. Mm-hmm. And 3 of the women told stories they had never told these people. Now, these are women who were together for 15 years, and they had never, ever spoke of their shame. And it changed everything, but it was fascinating to me to realize that sometimes we just need that permission. Mm-hmm. And so I have learned that, and I really do believe very strongly that the more we share, the more permission we give others to do the same. And, the perfectionism and the wanting to be loved and all of that is so common, and especially with women. I mean, I can identify 100% with you. But Jamie, you have to understand that if someone reacts to something that you've written, it's not about you.
Right.
It's about
them. And I even thought that when you shared that story with those 3 women in that circle, which you do call it the journaling circle. Is that correct?
Yeah, a journaling circle.
So I want to ask a couple questions about that, but I find that interesting. For 15 years, these 3 women, and that
was a group. That was different than my.
That was different. Okay.
That was their own. They had their own private group that they. Okay. I was not part of it.
Okay.
I just came to teach that group.
Gotcha. But they still opened up and shared things.
Right.
And it sounds like these women were pretty close. And
they hadn't shared some of
wow.
the biggest stuff in their lives. It's
Wow.
fascinating to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So tell me about the journaling circle and some of the different, so I guess some of it, if someone wants to, here's a question first, before you tell me about the journaling circle. This is where I'm curious. Is it like you have two different things, whereas one is just how you journal for your own private things, and then another class where you teach how to write and leave your legacy like for others?
So the journaling circle is totally different than legacy. So
Okay.
the legacy class is people who are interested in looking at their life, how they're living it, and what their legacy might be and what they might want to leave behind. The journaling circle is purely for journaling. And that I had taught journaling workshops when I worked at the Holocaust Center. One of my jobs was to to facilitate a teacher institute. So it was a week-long institute for teachers every year on helping them to teach the Holocaust. And the very first thing we did on Monday morning was I did a journaling workshop with them and explained to them how important it was to be able to journal while they're doing something as important and difficult as teaching the Holocaust. And then also to inspire them to not only write for themselves, but to have their students write, and to model. So when their students are writing, they need to be writing too. So that's a whole different thing. The journaling circle started at the very beginning of COVID. I was asked by someone who heads the caring community in Miami through the Jewish Federation if I would do a journaling circle for people, just because everyone was stuck at home, and he thought that might be something good to do. And so I started in April of 2020, and we started meeting on Sunday mornings. There were originally 20 people, there are now 15. We've been meeting, yesterday we had our 153rd meeting, and it's basically just, I always read a quote and then give them prompts, and periodically I will stop and have people share, only by choice. But in that group are 6 therapists, all different kinds of therapists. And our conversations have gotten so deep. They don't necessarily read what they've written, but they sure talk about what they've written and what it's brought up for them. And it's something that I do I don't charge, I just do it. But I do it because it speaks to my soul. I mean, I am so enthused and so moved every Sunday that I want to just keep going.
Wow. That's incredible. So if someone hasn't journaled, or maybe they're a seasoned journaler, is there any tips you could give someone? And maybe it's just getting started. Do you think prompts help? Where does someone go?
I just did a 15-minute piece for an organization called Pen to Print on journaling tips and what it all means. So I'll try to share as much as I can remember. There are a few tips, and the most important thing is, I think, to always date an entry, to put the day and the year, because if one wants to go back, you want to know when you wrote that. And the second thing is to not censor anything you write. So those are the only 2 rules in journaling. Otherwise, everything goes. What I say to someone who hesitates or has no idea where to start, I say start with right now I'm thinking, or right now I'm feeling. Just get yourself into the present, what you're thinking, put your pen on paper or type into the computer or on a phone. There are apps on the phone, however one wants to do it. But just be in the moment and write about what's going on in your head in that moment. And that kind of takes us, our pen flows after that. So that's the best way. Some people can only write with journal prompts, and that is not me. It's not my favorite way to journal by any means, although I do it with everyone else in our writing circles, journaling circles. But there are all kinds of prompts. All one has to do is Google journaling prompts for self-care, journaling prompts for inspiration, journaling prompts for the month of August. I mean, they're all there on the internet. And I get a lot of the prompts that I use by looking on the internet. Some just come to me, but it's just a matter of doing it. And then for some people, it's like they will start a journal and they will write when things are really bad. They'll write through an issue and then stop in the middle and be done with that journal. And then eventually pick up another journal. So a lot of people write when they're hurting and not when things are good. And that's okay. That's fine. I much prefer writing all of it because it's a nice balance to have a little of the good and a little of the not so good. But I do believe that to start a writing habit, one might just set a timer and say, this week I'm going to write for 10 minutes every morning. And I do believe writing in the morning is, for me, the best time. It's not for everyone, but for me it is. And then after 1 week, set a timer for 15 minutes and just keep going, or just commit. It doesn't have to be timed, but just commit. This week I'm going to do this. No matter what, this is going to be part of what I do every day.
And I think it has to become that routine because, maybe one day it's 2 lines, maybe the next day it's 2 pages, but just to get in that routine, I think is huge, definitely. So the difference then, what would it be like if someone is more leaving a legacy then? How does that look different?
So leaving a legacy would be a certain project that one might do. So my very favorite is called an ethical will. And an ethical will is basically a spiritual document, and it contains one's life lessons, values, and beliefs, hopes, and dreams. And so I always start to help people write their ethical wills by having people tell me, for example, something meaningful, a story in their life, and then I'll ask, what did you learn? And so just basically making a list of all our life lessons and starting there, and then sharing not only the life lessons, but information around that lesson, how you learned it, what it means to you, why it means. Values and beliefs, also the same kind of thing, where one can just talk about what's important, education, family, caring, whatever those things are that matter. And then what you're wishing for these people. So people write ethical wills, sometimes to children, grandchildren, family members, loved ones. One of the really important things about legacy work is that people need to understand that you do not have to be a parent to leave a legacy. So I will just say that I had a woman in one of my classes who did not have children. She wasn't married at the time. And she came to every class and was very enthusiastic. But one day I noticed there were tears streaming down her eyes during the whole class. And I kept saying, are you okay? And she said, yes. I said, fine. And so I asked her to stay after class and talk to her. And why she was crying was because she said, I don't have kids. I don't know why I'm even doing this. However, this person was a neonatal nurse and had been for 25 years. Had probably touched more lives than most of us will ever, and had 11 nieces and nephews who loved her dearly. And I said, listen, look at your life. And so I always start my classes by saying, you do not have to be a parent to do this. In fact, I was asked to speak as a keynote speaker for this big event where they were honoring a couple, and they wanted me to talk about creating their legacy. And people creating their Jewish legacy is what it was. But they were honoring these people, this couple who did not have children. And they kept saying to me, just remember that, you can't talk about kids because this is going to be so insulting. And it was so easy because it's just not an issue. Right. We touch so many lives in so many different ways without even realizing what we're doing. And I think that's really important.
So important, just going to the grocery store, interacting with the cashier, or, there's a small little grocery store by where I live, and I'm in there almost daily, it seems like. And I was just talking with someone about this a couple days ago, how you notice the turnover in people because you start to form these bonds, even with, the guy stacking the shelves. You get chit-chatting over the years and you learn names, and I mean, you're leaving your legacy just right there. It's speaking, you know, you have value. Thank you for what you're doing. You know, I mean, things like that.
I have a great story about that. So there are different categories of legacy that I talk about. One is the legacy that we leave on strangers that we don't know, people that we don't know. And so I have a friend who lived half the year in Miami Beach and half the year in North Carolina. And she went to the same grocery store, and there was only one cashier, and this woman never smiled, and it was driving my friend crazy. So Linda said, one day she said, I've decided I am not going to give her the money until she looks up at me and smiles. And so they played tug of war. Linda said it took 5 minutes. This woman kept pulling the money and Linda wasn't letting go. Finally, the woman looked up and Linda said, oh my God, you have the most beautiful green eyes. At which point this woman broke out into a huge smile. And Linda said, oh, look at your smile. She said, I've never seen you smile. And I never want to walk in the store again when you're not smiling. And Linda said the woman was like a different person from then on.
Oh.
So we just don't know. We just don't know whose life we're going to touch. Another example of that was years ago, one of my friends had ALS. So this is probably 35 years ago. And I went to visit, he was young, and I went to visit him. And there was a man sitting there who was from a hospice organization. And in those days, hospice was not what hospice is now. I didn't even know really what hospice was. But he was a stranger. And he came to visit my friend Jules every single week. And it was like a Wednesday afternoon. And I was so taken with this man who was sitting there just visiting my friend.
Yeah.
And so fast forward, maybe 10 or 15 years after that, something happened in my life that was difficult. And someone had told me when you're going through a bad time, the best thing to do is volunteer. So I looked in the paper, there was an ad for hospice training to volunteer. I decided to sign up. I did the training. I have worked with hospice patients for years and years as a result of that. It wasn't until I started teaching the course and I started going through the different categories of legacy that I came across this the one about legacy of a complete stranger. And all of a sudden it dawned on me that it was that man sitting in my friend's living room who planted the seed for me. And somewhere in the back of my mind, hospice work became something that was one of the most meaningful things I've done in my life. And it was all the result of a stranger who I wouldn't know if I saw him today, but yet he planted the seed that gave me some of the greatest opportunities.
That's incredible. And I feel you know those seeds because you journal and you're doing the legacy work. It's so easy to live life so fast, like a blur. And I think because I've really started to try to journal daily, and it's that special time, just being with yourself and slowing down, that once you get in that habit, you crave it, but then you even open up and you see so much about, like you said, you know, these past seeds or that man and how things start to fit together. And I even think when you went back through all of those years and years of journals, like it's fascinating to look at your own life sometimes and how it's evolved. And I don't know, that's just it is so fascinating. So if someone's never really done any of this, because I know for me, it would think like, okay, do I have to go back and start in the past? Do people ever feel like that or do that? Or do you recommend just, sticking with the here and now, and as it goes on, maybe things will come up? Because I can see where that question would pop up. Where do I start? Is there a good starting point or not really?
In my classes, I suggest a few things. One of the things I suggest is going through photos, because photos really bring back memories. Of course, now photos are all online, but I have bins filled with photographs.
Wow.
That's a great way to bring up memories. And another way is to create a timeline. and then fill in the memories accordingly, or fill in the things that one might want to share based on a timeline. So those are two ways, if one were willing to go back and look through their lives and figure out what it is in those experiences that they would want to share with someone else.
Wow. Yeah, that's cool. That's a great idea. I guess we all have to start, we have to dig through our old Polaroids from our childhood, right?
Yeah.
But I do think that because it is so easy now to take pictures on our phones and we don't do anything with them like we did before. And getting back to, maybe print some, it's so easy now to print out a photo album, at Walgreens or something, and just to have that stuff kind of laying around. And I think, one thing about that too is when my kids were little, I was so good at doing photo albums, and life just takes you in different directions. And I've talked lately how I need to get back to doing that, because every so often they get them out and it does create all of these memories again. And then we all reminisce and talk about these old memories and experiences and things that we did. It keeps the memories alive. And
absolutely. There's another thing that I suggest, and that's a legacy letter. So I call it a legacy love letter. And it's something that one would write for an occasion. So for a birthday, for a wedding, for a graduation, just to write and pass along whatever messages you want to pass along. One of the women in one of my classes, as a legacy project, decided she would write a legacy letter to each of her grandchildren. And she began with her oldest, who was getting married, and she wrote him a letter. And 2 days before the wedding, or day before, she sat down with him and his future bride and read the letter to him. And then after they came back from their honeymoon, her grandson called and said, we got some fabulous presents, but the one that had the most meaning and our very favorite was the letter that you gave us. Because really, that says so much about just passing along to someone you love. So I've done that quite often. And I just think that it's an easy way to do it. And it's something that people would cherish.
Definitely. Oh, yes.
I had a friend who had a bone marrow transplant. She had lymphoma, and she was hoping to live, but she didn't know whether she would or not. And she was at Vanderbilt, and I went and spent some time with her while she was in the hospital. And I suggested that she write a letter to each of her sons. I said, hopefully that this letter will be there and they will have it, but you're going to live a long time. Well, unfortunately, she didn't. And her husband saved the letters, and he ended up giving it to them, each boy at a different time. But one was right before his wedding. And he sat down and he read the letter the night before. And he told me that it was one of the most meaningful things his mother could have done for him, because it was just all these messages that she wanted to pass along for when he grew up. And then when she died, her husband wrote letters to 150 people saying, whatever memories you have of Bonnie, pictures, letters, anything, please send to me. And so people did, and he put it into a book, which he made 3 copies of, and gave each boy a copy of the book. And one of the sons said to me, I feel in a way that I know my mother better than I might have when she was alive, because people shared so much of her background and who she was in a way that I wouldn't have known otherwise. One woman who was dying, when I helped her write her ethical will, asked me if I would read it at her funeral. And I'll never forget the day I stood up. There were about 400 people at the funeral, and it was so powerful to me. I'm used to speaking publicly, and I don't get nervous, but I was so emotional, because sitting in the front row was the family that she had written this ethical will for. Her grandchildren, her children, her husband. And it was so moving, because it was her words. The funeral ended with her passing along her words and messages to them.
Wow. I can only imagine. I can picture all of it, all of these stories. Oh my goodness. Merle, this has been a fabulous conversation. Oh, thank you so much. I feel like my mental list of all the things I want to do now. This is great, but it makes it encouraging and fun and just it's meaningful to other people, but it's meaningful to ourselves to kind of examine our own lives too. It truly is. It's who we show up as. I think of the word just design. I mean, we're designing our lives as we leave our legacy, for one. And journaling is just, I think of a lot of the journaling is just, yeah, it's designing your life, but it's also making sense of it and healing from things and so much more. So much more.
My thought is this. We think we're doing this as a gift to someone else, but the real gift is the gift we give ourselves.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's time well spent. That is for sure. Time well spent.
It is.
So if people want to find you, read your books, all that, like tell us all that stuff, please.
Okay. I have a website. It's Merle R. Saferstein. So it's MERLERSAFERSTEIN.com. And I have my social media on there as well. I have information about journaling. I have a lot of information about journaling, some about legacy. My books are on there as well. Books can be bought on Amazon or any place one buys books. And I'm happy if anyone is interested in doing legacy work. I'm certainly happy to get somebody started.
Awesome. So do you do one-on-one legacy work and group?
I do.
Okay.
When
So
I'm actually
all like say with the groups, are those all in person? Do you do online groups or?
I always did in person until COVID. Okay. And COVID, I have to say, spoiled me. So now I do a lot of online and people all over the world, really, which is kind of exciting. I'm not doing as many legacy classes as I'm going to start teaching a class based on my books. So they will encompass different chapters, so different subjects, and then legacy work involved in that and some kind of writing. I haven't really formulated the whole thing, but that's my next step.
It'll flow.
Okay.
Right? Okay. No doubt about it. Oh, well, thank you so much. And I'll put all the information in the show notes as well, too. So it was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Jamie. It was wonderful to be here and talk to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much for listening to Authentically Raw. I'd love to hear from you. Shoot me an email, jamie@jamieberris.com, and let me know what episodes resonate with you and why. Are you a people pleaser? If so, I need your help. Please, I'm writing a book about people pleasing titled The People Pleaser's Guide to Pissing People Off to improve your relationships, especially the one you have with yourself. And I'm looking for personal stories of how people pleasing has impacted your life or sucked the life out of you. Maybe people pleasing has held you back, caused you to feel resent, regret, anger, powerlessness, or just plain exhaustion. Let me know how it's impacted your life. Who knows, maybe your story will inspire my writing and grace the pages in some shape or form in this handy-dandy little guide. Also, if you enjoy the Authentically Raw content, please support the show by following and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. Simply scroll down through the episodes and you will see where to do so. Want to learn more about life coaching? Head over to my website, jamieberris.com, and check it out. You can also follow me on social media at Jamie Berris for lots of inspiration and empowerment. One last thing, I'm rooting for you. Be real, be raw, be authentic.